Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here for Rise of the Machines, the future of AI and cybersecurity. If you haven't yet followed us on LinkedIn, I encourage you to do so. We have a lot of programming, thought leadership, and education around cybersecurity there that we would love you to take advantage of. In addition to that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. This is Reg Harnish. He is a nationally recognized cybersecurity veteran, investor, board member, advisor, speaker, and to me, most importantly, CEO of OrbitalFire. Reg, with that, why don't you take it over?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Let me start the talk by saying that as far as we know right now, human beings, well, and listen, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, based on this picture, human beings are the most intelligent, dominant species in the universe. Let's just start there, because I think that assumption is generally what we're talking about today. Obviously, we're going to focus in on some of the cybersecurity effects and influences in AI. But the reality is, the reason that AI exists is because the human race fails in certain ways, or doesn't move fast enough, or makes errors, or maybe isn't economically feasible. But, when I started writing code, I was 13, really right around the time this picture was taken. And back then, computers were not very functional. It took brute force. I mean, just superhuman feats of strength and will to get a computer to do anything. My first computer was the size of a paperback, and it had no storage. You could plug in a cassette player if you wanted to back something up, but there was no storage on board, and it was like 4K of RAM. So if you wanted it to do anything, you actually had to turn it on, hammer on it for 45 minutes, and then pray that it worked. And even then, the work and the output was really just basic math, or basic, sort of question response, or even video games back then were really rudimentary. And even if I think about, moving forward from, when I started coding to 20 years into the future, still at that point, or even today, honestly, even with AI and some of the advances that we've had in software engineering and autonomy, most software still requires triggering or some events for it to do anything. It's not operating autonomously. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had autonomous software around for a very long time, but I think for us, the way I started this conversation is the idea that autonomous software could eventually run the universe, and where does it go from there? But I think the question that we want to answer, whether it's in cybersecurity or otherwise, is, are we really ready for this? And is this something that we truly want? It does seem like we are moving in that direction at a frenetic pace. Just what's happened in AI just recently, whether it's basic headlines or the advances with like ChatGPT and others, it seems like that has accelerated, and that we've already made our decision. But I think there are some concerns and things that we should be considering in terms of, the downsides of an alternate reality like this. But I think in terms of understanding where we might be going, it's important to understand where we have been. Because as I mentioned, autonomous software has been around for decades. So this is Arthur Samuel. And Arthur Samuels was a computer scientist at IBM back in the 1950s. And he loved playing checkers. So he wrote a little program so that he could play checkers against the computer. And Arthur would go and play, and he would win. He would play, he would win. He would play, and he would win. And that's because the computer only knew what a legal move was. But Arthur Samuel had something else. Arthur had strategy. And so he wrote a little subprogram, and all it did was run in the background and calculate the likelihood that a given board configuration would result in a win. and he let that run. And then he would go back and play the computer and he would win. And he'd play the computer and he'd win and play and he'd win. And then Arthur Samuels left the computer to play itself. It played itself, it generated more data. It generated more data, it increased the accuracy of its predictions. Then Arthur Samuels went back to play the computer and he lost. And he played and he lost and he played and he lost. And Arthur Samuels had created a robot that exceeded his ability in a task that he taught it. And we weren't really thinking about it at the time, but this was the moment that we created a new species, right? If we think about where AI may be heading, the big concern is, does this thing, which I'm not sure what this thing is, but does this thing become sentient? Does it become conscious around its decisions? Does it become emotional? Big concerns. But back in the 50s, we were already working towards autonomy in software. Another great example is back in World War II, when we really had nothing but mechanical computers. And the case of the B-29, which of course was just a workhorse of World War II, it was equipped with 15 Browning M50 machine guns, or M150 caliber machine guns. The problem was the plane was not capable of carrying all those guns, all that ammunition, and 15 operators for each of the guns. And so they came up with a computer where a single human being could operate all 15, and it would adjust, based on ballistics and, wind shear and a whole bunch of other things, where should it be aiming the other 15 guns based on where the gunner was pointed. So back in the 50s, or I'm sorry, the early 40s, we had autonomous software. And again, you could argue that this was largely an event-driven system, managed or handled by a human being. And I can't argue that, but we still had the ability to use software to do things automatically based on some trigger or some conditions. Fast forward 2 decades, we started seeing traffic cameras, which weren't necessarily better, but they were faster and they were more economical than beat cops, or patrol officers who were driving around giving tickets. Of course, it had problems, and as software advanced, we also saw the problems advance as software attempted to do more autonomously through intelligence and data-driven, conditioning. We started to see more issues. Of course, in this case, traffic cameras would give a ticket to the registered driver, no matter who was driving the vehicle. And that became a real problem. So we started to see fewer and fewer of these. But make no mistake, these traffic cameras were far more economical, easier to deploy, more reliable, and honestly, passed no judgment. And so they were without bias. They simply tracked speed and handed out a ticket automatically based on that one condition. And so while it may seem very rudimentary, actually, in terms of autonomy, traffic cameras were a huge advance for us and solved a lot of the problems that we are trying to solve with autonomous software and AI, whether it's in cybersecurity or otherwise, which is the economics, the reliability, there's a lot of other conditions that make human beings not a great solution. And traffic cameras did a really good job. Fast forward to 2016, Microsoft came out with its first automated or autonomous chatbot, primarily for support, but it was also based on a language model we call the internet. Now, we've all remember the internet back in 2016, not exactly a place where mature intelligence may have existed. And we already started to see the decline or the introduction of disinformation and other problems with facts or finding facts on the internet. But Microsoft forged ahead, and it was called TAY, T-A-Y. And Microsoft tasked TAY with responding to support requests, other social media inquiries, and for a while, a couple of weeks, it was actually doing quite well. where it started to show its issues is in sourcing that large language model and the model that it was using for responses based on the internet, which again, of course, was biased, was partial, was incorrect. And so Tay used the best of humankind to respond to certain questions. And of course, there were problems that started to arise. So of course, Tay was discontinued. We started to see more fractures, as we continued to invest in and develop autonomous software and ask software to do more and more and more. Everyone knows that a grocery store knows more about us than our spouse in some cases. It knows when you're sick, it knows when you're happy, it even knows who you're going to vote for, even if you don't, because it has a whole bunch of information about crowdsourced data around who buys what party do they tend to be affiliated with, and can do all of this analysis pretty quickly. So grocery stores were in a really strong position to start introducing new features and benefits to their shoppers based on their shopping habits and the types of demographics and psychographics that they were able to generate through this information. This is actually about a grocery chain in New Zealand who started using shopping habits and what was in your cart at the time, real-time advice on recipes. Now they started pushing it through again. Some of these things were challenged, and shoppers started to see some interesting recipes. One here for chlorine gas. Another one of my favorites was Oreo flavored quiche. So again, we started to see some cracks. It was doing something, perhaps that we wanted it to do, but honestly, not truly succeeding in a way. So that was discontinued. But where I think we really started to see AI and autonomous software start to be used against us, I won't call it weaponized yet, but Uber has been the master of this for some time. And it's created some interesting challenges, of course. But through terms and conditions and a lot of legal contract, Uber has somehow avoided a lot of the user scrutiny and driver scrutiny that probably they deserve. Because when you open the Uber app, all of us use Uber, but when you open that app and you're looking for a driver, you probably see a bunch of cars and then they start to move around and maybe do some wonky things, go around the block or spin and that's because those drivers may not exist at all. Because when you agreed to Uber's terms and conditions, you didn't agree to drive or a ride sharing service, you agreed to an experience. That's literally the word that Uber uses. And so when you start up the app and you see 5 drivers who are ready and waiting for your call, a big percentage, I believe it's up to 40% of those, can be fictitious. Now, why does Uber do this? Well, of course, they want riders to feel like there's lots of drivers out there ready to take their ride, and they don't want Uber riders hanging up or disconnecting and moving to Lyft or hailing a cab. And so they wanted to give this idea or this experience that there were a lot of drivers out there available. So the next time you select a driver and it does something wonky or it switches or it spins around, what Uber is doing is actually finding a real driver for you, not the one you selected necessarily, but a real driver that can actually get you from point A to point B. But it happens on the other side as well. So when drivers log into the app, of course, they're presented with the same experience, which is a whole bunch of potential riders. Now, as drivers are scrolling through, selecting the riders that they want, keep in mind that they also agreed to a 40% fictional reality. And up to 40% of those riders could be part of the experience, part of the matrix. And of course, because they don't want drivers, seceding and going to Lyft or driving a cab. And so we have to start to recognize that Uber is not really the first, but maybe one of the best examples of how we are beginning to live in the matrix, which means that the vast majority of activities that we engage in create ones and zeros, and we consume ones and zeros. But those ones and zeros are they're flawed, and I want to talk about why that is. But let me get to the most serious case here, which is Tesla. Obviously, everyone is aware of Tesla's autopilot. They don't call it that; they call it driver-assisted, whatever it is. But basically, they expect that a human being is going to be in the car with their hands on the wheel. Of course, we know that there's abuse of those systems. But back in 2021, I believe it's 20 or 2021, a Tesla killed its first human being. Now, of course, this made national news. It was the first time it happened, and everyone was up in arms because the driver was on assist mode, and the Tesla made the decision to run over a pedestrian. Now, they went and analyzed the black box. Every Tesla comes with a black box recorder, like a flight recorder, that tracks every decision that the software has made, so they could go back and analyze that. And when they did that, something really interesting occurred. They found out that the software was not defective, but that the software analyzed all of its options and decided that running the pedestrian over was the best one. Now, that may seem crazy, but don't forget, the software all of a sudden now needs to decide, is the pedestrian elderly? Is it a child? And is the child's life on the sidewalk more important than the driver's life or others who might be riding in the car? We've left this life and death decision up to a computer. And in my opinion, it wasn't so important that a Tesla hit a pedestrian. Cars hit pedestrians hundreds, I don't know, thousands of times every day. But this was the first time that a computer made the decision to kill a human being. And now we really had no precedent on how do we handle this, the legal precedent, the criminal precedent. And it raised the question, are we ready to allow a computer a life or death decision? And it wasn't just once. There have been 42 deaths caused by Teslas in driver assist mode. And again, when we think about the conditions, or really the concern, it's not so much that a human being is injured by a vehicle, but rather that it was injured by a vehicle driven by a robot, by software. Now, while life and death may seem important, I would argue that, at least in America, the economics of AI are probably a bigger concern. We are already seeing AI, I'd like to use the word influence, but destroy may be a better word. We use AI, of course, to generate imagery and, in marketing and branding elements and things like that. But there are entire industries that are in question right now because of AI. One is music or entertainment. A startup called Mubert has produced 100 million AI generated songs, and it did it almost instantly. Just keep in mind, 100 million, that's the same as the entire library at Spotify. So in a very short period of time, a computer was able to generate as much content as you can get from Spotify. And it did it basically for free, or whatever it cost them to cool those computers, that data center. And the music industry was really sort of caught off guard by this. And the question became, well, do we need human artists anymore? And if we can't tell the difference, how does that affect the economics of the model, right? We thought we had settled, we moved from, when I grew up in the, 70s and 80s, music was very different, and the business of music was very different. Then streaming came, but now we're looking at this concept of computer generated music, and whether you like the music or not may not matter. because we can change the music that gets generated by changing code. What we may not be able to be so resilient with is the economic impact of this and how it potentially an entire industry might change overnight. Another one is literature. Authors who at one time were affected by an Amazon bestseller list, that 19 out of 20, I think, of the best sellers on Amazon's list was generated by an AI, generated by a bot. And most of it was nonsense, like apricot barcode architecture. That was the title of the book, and yet it was on the bestseller list. So you have to ask yourself, well, if authors don't need to write and musicians don't need to music or create music, where does that leave us in a whole bunch of other industries? Again, being a capitalist society, not to say that we don't value life, but economics is at the root of our society. And so these may have an even bigger impact on our lives and our future than the fact that Teslas may be errantly injuring or killing human beings. Now, what does this have to do with cybersecurity? So, I've been in cybersecurity for, I don't know, roughly 20 years. And, back in the early 2000s, there was nothing like this. There was no automation. Very little was being done that wasn't directly programmed or configured by a human being. And I would argue some of the most successful security controls today are still human driven. That's not to say that human beings aren't the greatest risk in cybersecurity, because I would still argue that they are, but generally not the way the industry wants you to think of that. But make no mistake, the cybersecurity industry is trying to monetize and, cash in on AI just like everyone else is. So let's talk about a few things that are critically important as we think about how AI is affecting and might affect cybersecurity going forward. Well, the first is when we ask ourselves, why do we do cybersecurity? When it comes down to it, the principle and the concept and the sort of the goals of cybersecurity are not about protecting, detecting, correcting, compliance. I mean, those are all activities that we perform in cybersecurity. But the goal of cybersecurity, in my opinion, is to manage risk, but to manage risk in the context of protecting the mission of the business, right? So whether you're a landscaper or you're Boeing, there is a mission, and you perform cybersecurity activities, you invest in cybersecurity because you have risks to intellectual property, data, credit card information, PII, your reputation, your bank account. And so if we boil this to the very highest level of cybersecurity, we're performing a function that is not easy to boil down to ones and zeros. There's a lot of subjectivity. There is a lot of compensation. There is context. There's variability, right? Everything changes every day. And so when we look at the AI that exists in cybersecurity today, and by the way, I'm not an AI cybersecurity expert. I am steeped in the industry and I see what's happening in my little world, or whatever world that is. But certainly, I don't want to be speaking for the entire industry right now. But I do see that vendors are racing to introduce AI features and functionality where maybe it's not really AI, or maybe it is AI, but it's not working all that well. But I would argue we've seen very little introduced that can help us manage risk, specifically with the goal of protecting the mission of a business, of an entity, a legal entity, a corporation, whatever it is. And it struggles because it's a very complex concept. We're not writing a college paper. This is a very different thing and a far more complex algorithm, in my opinion. I would also argue that risk itself has a couple of challenges, which I want to come back to. Now, a few other challenges is that as you know, we pursue AI, one of the things that I will talk about and that the industry is talking about is this concept of bias, right? We want to eliminate all bias. We want complete equality and equity in the decision making. So when the Tesla is trying to decide between running over a male or a female, they should have equal chances of getting run over. Or the elderly, or a Muslim versus a Christian. I mean, this is all trying to be baked into these large language models. We struggle with it because these models really rely on past experiences, past content, existing, content, all of which is biased, right? Or is wrong. And so there's other challenges. Let me come back to that. But today, if we were to take a non-biased or unbiased model and apply that to cybersecurity tools, that really wouldn't work as well. We actually want bias in cybersecurity because there is a good guy and a bad guy, or a good girl and a bad girl. And so as we pursue, elimination of bias in these tools, we're actually, in my opinion, decreasing the odds that the AI in a cybersecurity tool would work well, because we want to program it to understand good and bad and identify the bad or respond automatically to the bad. If we consider all things equally good and bad, it has a hard time doing that. Now, this is challenging because we need more activity in cybersecurity, more productive activity in cybersecurity. We've been fighting with a talent shortage for probably a decade. I mean, certainly going back to my early days, it was very difficult to find folks, and we've certainly not solved that problem. And while AI and computers might be faster and cheaper, they're not necessarily better today. But to compound the talent shortage issue, and so AI and cybersecurity not doing what we need it to do, we've also seen a trend where things like AI and other trends are keeping people from getting into cybersecurity to begin with. And so, we have this challenge that we're faced with manufacturing more cybersecurity talent, yet the industry itself is driving people away, and our inability to demonstrate progress with AI has not helped in this situation at all. So, the AI that you're seeing in marketing and ads, and certainly, again, every vendor is trying to capitalize on this. A lot of times that's really in sort of these rules-based engine where maybe they had a bunch of if-then case statements, or they had some machine learning, or some, just some formulaic rules engine that was processing inputs and pushing outputs. That we haven't done a great job of converting that into the ability to make better decisions on behalf of humans, but of course on behalf of risk and protecting the business mission in a way that would replace human beings. But I think another systemic issue exists with AI because there are truly two parts to security. The first is the reality of security, and the second is how we feel about it. If we think about AI, it really hasn't gotten to the point where it has emotion. However, the vast majority of decisions made in cybersecurity are either influenced or at least impacted, if not completely controlled, by our feelings about cybersecurity, because you can feel secure even when you're not. And sometimes even when you are secure, or you are secure, it doesn't feel that way. And that's because a lot of our decision-making in cybersecurity comes from cognitive bias in our emotion, in our limbic system, lizard brain. It's instinct, it's emotion, it's other things, which we've not, I don't think, really scratched the surface on from an AI standpoint. So sometimes reality is where we want to be, but sometimes feelings are important. And when we think about who's buying and investing in cybersecurity, oftentimes these are people who are moved or motivated by the emotions of cybersecurity. Now, we know that these two things are different. The reality and the feelings are different. And we know that they don't always overlap. But the goal, of course, is to develop a system where autonomous software can consider both of these and make better decisions. But we are apparently very far from an ability to do those things and operate in that way. So how does an autonomous software universe affect cybersecurity and other things? So there's some risks. And this actually goes beyond cybersecurity, but I'll try to stick to the cyber effects of these things. I talked a little bit about bias, but outside of cybersecurity as well, these large language models are based on human content. And we know that human beings are naturally biased, and maybe for good reason. And by trying to strip bias from the system, one, we are doing a very good job of that. I think past failures in this area have shown us that as long as you leave a computer to learn from humans, we're going to replicate a lot of those issues. But also, again, in our effort to strip bias from these tools, we may be neutering the very tools that we're trying to build, right? Again, in cybersecurity, maybe it's not a clear distinction, but certainly we could probably categorize or identify undesirable behavior from desirable behavior. Gray area, admittedly, for sure. But bias is a real problem because for most of the planet, we're trying to strip this. We're trying to introduce equity for all parties involved. And then in cybersecurity, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to train it on recognizing things that are absolutely bad. And the system just doesn't work. Misinformation. AI has created a huge opportunity for folks that want to generate information, and whether it's to, obfuscate the real facts, of course, which is one of the goals, or to create something more sinister, which I'll talk about here at the end. Misinformation has become a big business, right? Going back to the 2016 elections, I would argue misinformation is rampant on the internet, and generally speaking, rampant everywhere in society, because we have a difficult time tracking down facts. There's a whole fact checker cottage industry that has sprouted over the last 10 years because it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between what's true and what may not be true. When I was a kid, if we wanted facts, we went to the library and we read encyclopedias, or we read books. We went to the library. My daughter, when she's growing up, instead of going to the library, she's going to go to the internet. Now, unfortunately, the internet is becoming less truthful, less honest, less transparent, and less of a system of information than it is misinformation. So when my daughter's children grow up, they're probably going to go back to the library, where everything, it's not like libraries can't exist without misinformation, and they do. However, this idea of a fact-checked statement or concept or information is really starting to vanish. And so where do we go? Well, even worse than misinformation, right? Someone just made an error, or it's an opinion piece, not necessarily based on evidence, is disinformation, where information has been weaponized. And again, going back to the 2016 election, bots and AI were doing a lot of the work of the Russians. We've kind of proven this out. We have all of the evidence and the forensic analysis to suggest that people are using computers and AI-generated content to change the decision-making of their audiences, or to give people a different feeling or perception about what reality might actually be. So we're starting to blend reality with this idea of feelings and emotion and this alternate world that I refer to as the Matrix, Because again, when we think about what we do and how we operate and how we exist in our daily lives, increasingly and acceleratingly, we are consuming ones and zeros to make decisions, and our decisions generate ones and zeros. And this exhaust from this consuming of data is becoming ambient. It's impossible to avoid. So disinformation is becoming a big deal. I'll hit real quickly on weaponization. We aren't really seeing, we OrbitalFire are not really seeing tons of AI-based attack tools or tactics, but it's happening. And we know that our adversaries have access to the exact same software and autonomy and models that we do. So as we're building walls up and building protections and improving our ability to detect risk, our adversaries are using the exact same tools to break all of that down. And so the weaponization of AI is as big a concern because it's like a hammer. Like you can build a house with a hammer or you can kill your neighbor. It's not really the hammer that makes that decisions. It's who's affecting activity, like who is involved, who is triggering this work. And so weaponization, we need to continue to have an eye on in cybersecurity, because as we advance, so do our adversaries. Now, I think those are the major risks to AI, whether it's in cybersecurity or elsewhere, but I think there's a couple of things that we need to think about. The first is, at some point, autonomous software will be uncontrollable. What I mean by that is there will not be an off switch. And it will increasingly be controlled by a third party, and usually an unknown third party. So whether it's Uber creating an experience for you, or it's the internet in general creating a perception of reality, or it's a third party who wants to control who you vote for. There's a lot of things about AI that we don't know today. What we do know is that you have less and less control over the way the internet, computers, robots, and data affect your life. You just have no control over that. That is almost exclusively in the hands of third parties. And there's a lot of third parties. The second serious issue here is that it's unavoidable. If you want to do anything today, whether it's communicate with your friends, if it's to shop, if it's to write a college essay, find your way to the grocery store, no way to avoid computers, and in many cases, autonomous software. There's just no way to unplug from this. Again, I go back to this analogy of the Matrix, which I think is just beautifully relevant, in the sense that once you jack in, you're in. Like your entire world, your entire universe is controlled by third parties, other people generating ones and zeros, and there's just no way to avoid it, right? The whole kind of precept to the Matrix movies was that there was this underground of people who figured out how to unjack or disconnect from the Matrix. We're struggling now. Try to put your phone down for a week or not use the internet for a full day. I think that you would find that very challenging. And every day that goes by, it becomes more and more unavoidable. Lastly, and probably the most worrisome for me, is that we are getting to the point where we can't distinguish between AI and human beings. Some of the ChatGPT stuff is real preachy, wordy, and there are tools that can generate some within like 98% efficacy, whether or not content was written by an AI tool or a human being. But that's vanishing as AI continues to get better, right? The ChatGPT 5, and of course, Elon and others are in this, in this industry now. It's going to get harder and harder to distinguish. Keep in mind, though, back to my first statement, we created a new species back in the 50s, and a species that has become somewhat competitive with the human race. Now think about this. What if you couldn't tell the difference between a human being and a turtle. Sounds ridiculous. But if you couldn't tell the difference, how would that affect your life? Do you treat turtles differently than you do human beings? Probably today. But what if you couldn't tell the difference? This acceleration of hyper-realistic reality simulation is going to create some massive challenges. It's going to affect our entire decision-making model. And as human beings, again, being the most intelligent, dominant species in the universe right now, we're starting to be challenged by a species that we don't control and is completely unavoidable. And in many cases in the future, we won't be able to tell the difference. You know, sort of like the T-1000 looked like a human being 99% of the time. You know, what does that mean? At the root of this is a problem with human beings, which is our limbic system, our reward system makes us not just susceptible, but willing participants in influence. And when we think about AI, in most cases, the goal, the pursuit is, how do I influence other people, whether it's who they vote for in an election, what cottage cheese they buy at the grocery store, what games they play, or how they feel about, you know, a manufacturer. That kind of influence is unbelievably powerful. So you stack up all of these things working against us and accelerating towards, you know, an autonomous software world with our desire to be influenced because we feel rewards when we consume that influence. It's a scary combination. These are things that we need to start thinking about. Okay, so what does the future look like? I think I can only really speak to the near term, but one is we know that it's moving too slowly, right? Despite marketing headlines and buzz and hype, most of that isn't stuff that has materially affected our jobs on a daily basis. It isn't materially improved our ability to manage risk or protect business missions. It's not really having a material impact in the industry at all. It's kind of sloth-like right now for some reason. I think because, you know, we've seen some of these systemic anchors in cybersecurity that are counterintuitive, at least, to the rest of the industry or where AI is headed in general. We know that it's faster. We know that it can be cheaper, but it's just not better than a human being today. And so that's created some challenges. And now we're seeing it all the way cascading up through venture capital and private equity. So these firms who invest heavily in, you know, cyber tech companies are now starting to ask the question, well, listen, we said AI was going to solve more problems for the customer and improve resilience, improve defensibility, manage risk, protect the mission, but it's not doing those things. We don't see any evidence that it's actually doing those things. So now what? Right. So the entire ecosystem, from the way cyber is financed through the way businesses execute and utilize these tools, is just not seeing the kind of positive effect that we were hoping for. And we'll see where that ends up. Now, there are some other challenges, right? The adoption curve. A good analogy is if we go back 15 years, maybe even 20 years, when the cloud was invented. We didn't call it the cloud back in 2000. We called it software as a service or other things. But in the beginning of the cloud, no one would put their secure data in the cloud because, well, it's not secure. And that was nonsense. Of course it was nonsense. The cloud is no more or less secure than a server sitting in a closet in your office building. Really, it comes down to what you're doing with it, right? But fast forward to today, everyone is pushing their secure data to the cloud because it's more secure. Also nonsense. It's no more secure or less secure. But we see these weird adoption curves, largely driven by the economics and crowd think. I think the same thing's going to happen with AI. In the beginning, right? So we're at a stage, and I kind of just described this, where we're kind of like poo-pooing AI and cybersecurity because we're just not seeing much going on here. Nothing really tangible or material happening. But at some point, the economics and the fact that we have no other options, every tool out there claims to be AI powered. At that point, what happens? Do we all just move to these tools, pay more perhaps, increase the complexity and the deployment time and the armies of people that are required to maintain these tools? Do we continue in that, that direction just because of this adoption curve? Well, that's to be seen. Certainly it's happened with most technology innovations that I've witnessed. And so I would expect that something similar is going to happen with AI. Both ends of the bell curve are irrational. We'll just have to see where we end up. Okay, a few final thoughts. One of the, in my opinion, the benefits of AI and a new species, a competitive species, right? We're the top of the food chain today, but that may not last forever, is that AI will solve all diversity issues, all of them, every single one. Religion, race, sexual orientation, doesn't matter. It's going to solve every single problem because at some point, it will be human beings against the robots. And we're both jockeying for position and competing, and everyone remembers how they felt on 9/11. Everyone was your friend because we had coalesced around a common enemy or a common adversary. That's exactly what's going to happen with AI. The more that we are experiencing, interacting with, or subject to robots and autonomous software and AI, the more our differences become meaningless. As human beings, we're not going to care about the color of your skin or what you look like or how you dress. It's going to be so trivial. So one of the benefits, we solve the diversity and inclusivity thing. We also automatically, as human beings, assume that technology gets better over time, but it does not. There are more features, but quality actually declines. Try making a cell phone call these days. See how that goes for you. Websites, 404s, like back in the day when we started running software, 20, 30, 40 years ago, not that I was there, but even the software that I was writing in the early 2000s, late 90s, if a page and it just didn't display and just said 404, we'd be like, what's going on here? Or if you picked up an analog phone and didn't get a dial tone, you'd be like, you'd think the world was ending. Today, if a phone call doesn't go through on your mobile, you just hit redial or you text, you hang up and try something else. If a page doesn't load in the browser, you just keep hitting refresh, refresh, refresh until it does. We've been assimilated, right? And our expectations around the quality of software have plummeted. We suffer through just a massive decline in the quality of technology. Every iOS version that comes out is buggier than the last. Every patch that's meant to address a critical vulnerability is buggier than the original software. Technology has become so complex. It breaks constantly. It's unavailable. It does amazing things when it works. Features are just inconceivable cases, but the quality has just become trash in most cases, and it's accelerating in that direction. Now, the thought I want to leave you with is that all of this may sound very futuristic or very, matrix sci-fi nonsense, but let me tell you something. Some of the most powerful people on earth believe that all consciousness should be treated equal. This is Larry Page. He's one of them. Founder of Google and one of the most wealthy, powerful, influential human beings to ever have walked this planet. Larry Page thinks that you and I are speciesists because we put priority on human beings over software consciousness. That's not what Larry Page thinks. Larry Page thinks that software, once sentient and conscious, should have the same rights, the same opportunities, the same everything as human beings. He's not alone. There is a growing faction of human beings who feel that replacing the human race with robots will likely be a good thing. And they are putting a lot of time, money, and energy into this pursuit. Don't trust me, just Google it. Back in 1999, I started a company with Kimball Musk, Elon's brother. So I knew Elon just a bit, and Elon was so out there, it was hard to even talk to him. But even Elon favors the human race. So he and Larry Page have had arguments, and they don't talk anymore. And you can see this in a Joe Rogan interview, or there's a recent Tucker Carlson interview with Elon. Larry Page called Elon a speciesist, not a racist, but a speciesist, because Elon prefers the human race to autonomous software. That's how far this has gone. So, I think it's really up to all of us to start to make some decisions, think about this. It's here, it's happening faster than maybe we thought it would. I mean, ChatGPT's been around for a year in any commercial or widely available or visible way. It's been a year. The human species is 250,000 years old. And in 1 year, even arguing back to the 50s, we created a species that has become competitive. I think it's worth thinking about. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But Dana, I'll hand it back to you. I'm not sure if I've generated any questions here.
We don't have any questions yet, but I would love for anybody, please, what do you think about what Reg is saying? And do you have any questions? We have the Q&A feature right at I think it's probably at the bottom, maybe the top of your screen, depending on your view. But please let us know what you're thinking.
Again, I encourage everyone, this could all be disinformation as well, misinformation at least. And so you should be challenging this. This could be, and we have done that. I mean, some of our recent social media content, we've used AI to generate fictional human beings. Now, it was to promote this actual talk. It's not something that we do on a regular basis, but we know it's possible. And who knows, I could be a robot.
That's right. And that's the big surprise for this webinar, is that this is an alternate Reg. Louis, thank you very much for your. So we do have a question. It says, up until this point, it seems AI has grown slowly. Do you see that changing in the future and there being a more rapid increase of both AI growth and acceptance?
Right. I mean, today we think about AI, all it does is write college papers, right? I'm oversimplifying. But I think as soon as someone figures out how to make a lot of money doing other things, it's going to happen overnight. It's going to be instantaneous. And there's a lot of this work I think has been going on, at some of these think tanks and behind the scenes at Google and Microsoft and other places that we really have no visibility to. I think, these, ChatGPT and its competitive, large language model generative tools have really only kind of come out in the last, again, in any real highly visible way in the last year or so. But a lot of the work was going on. I think as soon as someone figures out how to make money, and then investors see that someone can make money, they're going to pour money into it as well. I think it's going to happen faster than we are probably comfortable with.
Thanks, Reg. And someone else asked, what would you say is or will be our biggest vulnerability against AI with respect to cybersecurity?
I think it depends on the timing. I think the first is that cybersecurity folks and their customers love silver bullets and flux capacitors. They love shiny gadgets that solve problems because the blue pill is way easier than sit-ups. And I think we will be at some point lulled into a false sense of security. So if I've got AI in my stack, then I've managed my risk, or I'm way less vulnerable. I think that's going to be a major issue because, you know, as professionals trying to educate businesses on their actual risks, the reality of vulnerability and risk, it's going to get harder and harder because even today, you know, I talk with people who's like, oh, I've got X, or I'm using this tool, or, and so I should be good, right? And we have to re-educate folks on what it actually means to have a tool at their disposal. I think that's going to be a major issue, but I think ultimately, and not to get too down on AI, but you know, the way I grew up, and certainly I've done enough, I've been in therapy long enough and studied enough, you know, psychology to know, or to believe, it's probably a better word, that true happiness, authentic, genuine happiness, comes from doing something really hard for a really, really long time and then eventually overcoming it, right? Succeeding. And, you know, when I think about every generation, life becomes more convenient and easier for every generation. I think one of the reasons we're seeing so much depression and, you know, self-image issues with younger generations is that we are continuously stripping away hard work and inconvenience and the need to develop a sense of and a real system of grit and fortitude. Like my parents had a much harder life than I did, for sure. But my daughter has a much easier life than I did. And I think the more that we strip away hard things that take a very long time, I think the less happy we are as a race. And I'm just not sure where that takes us. So that's my long-winded answer.
Reg, thank you. And as a mother of teenagers, I agree with this 100%. Another question, and I will not confirm nor deny that Reg is a robot. But on top of that, Reg, how do you think we'll be able to differentiate content communication from AI?
At some point, you won't be able to, right? But that's also the objective. Let's keep in mind is if I had a tool that could mine all of my past content and create new content for me, I would use it. There's nothing, I can't find anything. And as far as, you know, our marketing team hasn't been able to find anything. It's getting better, but I would certainly use it because it will save me time. And that there's an economic impact to saving people time. So the objective of AI is to be indistinguishable, but it also becomes one of the major risks is if we can't truly distinguish it, there's no digital watermark, if there's no way to tell with sophisticated tools the difference between the human species and a sentient autonomous software species, I think it creates massive challenges. It affects our entire decision-making. The entire system of decision-making becomes invalid in many ways. I think indistinguishability, if that's a word, is going to be something that we need to address head on.
Last, so certainly, please, if you think of anything after this, I know that we are here. You can always contact us, reach out via LinkedIn directly, or you can go to sales@orbitalfire.com. And we'd be more than happy to, you know, continue this conversation and answer any of your questions. Reg, with that, do you have any, you know, final thoughts?
That's it. Thank you. I appreciate your time today. It's a fascinating area and topic, one I know very little about, honestly, but it's certainly intriguing, and we'll have to see where it goes.
That's great. And everyone, if you registered, you will get a copy of this. It's also going to be up on our YouTube page if you want to swing back or forward it on to anybody. We encourage you to do so. But thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.